Today we're going to swap out a bad Joslyn Clark motor starter, and the only motor starter that I do have on the service truck today is an IEC type motor starter with the overload and the extra auxiliary contact. Now I could go out and shop for a more expensive legacy Joslyn Clark type starter, or just use what I got on the truck, swap it out and get the machine up and running today. Alright, so I'm all set up, ready to swap out this Joslyn Clark contactor. The first thing I want to do is make sure that the power is off and the disconnect is shut down, and that there's no feeding power to the starter here. Once I confirm that, I'll take my flathead drill, I'll loosen up pull out the power wires, push those off to the side so they're not in the way. Before I start disconnecting the old motor starter, I want to put together the new one, and then as I'm taking out the wires off of the old starter, we'll put them onto the new one. Now the first thing I want to put together is your contactor and your overload. Your overload has little brass prongs that are sticking up. Your overload is going to go underneath your contactor. Put your contactor in. Take your drill. Tighten down each terminal. Now I got the contactor and the overload together. Now this contactor does come with one motor starter auxiliary contact. Since this electrical schematic requires 3 normally open auxiliary contacts, I'm going to add the 2 extra. There's a little black thing sticking out on the side of it, and then on the side of the contactor you got a little place where that little black plastic thing pops right in. Once you get it in, just push it back and it snaps right in, and then it can't come out. So now that's a fully assembled IEC motor starter. Now your Joslyn Clark one here, we're going to start by removing the wires from the auxiliary contacts. Now if you look at the Joslyn Clark, the auxiliary contacts are right here on the side. They got front and rear, and they got little open symbols. So this side has 2 and this side has 1, which these little auxiliary contacts are the same exact mechanism that's on the side of this IEC contactor. So once I start pulling wires out of the old one, what I like doing is I like putting them into the new contactor. That way I don't get confused on what wire goes to where. I already know that the front auxiliary contact is all one contact, so I'll just start removing the wires individually and putting them back into putting them into the new contact auxiliary contacts. So I just removed and replaced all the auxiliary contacts from the Joslyn Clark starter over to the new starter. Now the next thing I'm going to do is remove the neutral from the bottom of the overload on the Joslyn Clark contactor. Usually the neutral is the color white. That's how it's usually represented. There's only one white wire that's going into the Joslyn Clark contact or overload. So what I'm going to do with this white wire is I'm going to identify the overload on the new contactor, and we're going to utilize the normally closed side. After we remove the neutral from the bottom of the overload of the Joslyn Clark starter and put the neutral in the overload of the new starter, you should be able to, you should have removed, all the wires should be removed already. You should be able to pull out the starter. Now just loosen up the mounting bolts that the starter is connected to. Pull the starter out. Now, a couple things I didn't point out was the coil for the Joslyn Clark. Now the coil on this Joslyn Clark actually has two fixed wires already going to it, where the Allen-Bradley one doesn't. So we're going to add those wires. But I just want to point out where the coil is on the Joslyn Clark, and then where the coil is on the new Allen-Bradley starter. All right, so now what we're going to do with the new starters, we're going to add the wires to the motor starter coil. I got a spare wire here, a piece of a wire that's white. This wire here is going to go into the bottom of the overload on the normally closed contact on the number 96 terminal. One end goes into number 96. Now the other end of this wire goes up to the motor starter coil on the A2 terminal. That completes your neutral to the motor starter coil. And now your positive wire goes in, your positive wire for the motor starter coil goes into the A1 terminal. And that completes your motor starter coil. Now, to mount this new contactor, it doesn't have the same footprint as the Joslyn Clark. So the way to mount this, there's two ways to mount this new starter. You have two mounting holes on each corner where you can drill a hole and put a screw through it to mount it, or you can use a DIN rail like I like doing. Makes it a little bit easier, where the DIN rail just snaps right into the back of the contactor. So what we're going to do is mount the DIN rail, add your transformer lines back to the starter. Now you can start adding your primary power back to the starter. After you got your primary power back in, adjust your overload to the right amperage per your voltage. Take your, on the bottom down here, you got your T1, T2, T3 terminal, and that's where your three wires for your motor are going to get wired into. After that, start your unit up and check rotation. You should be good.